When it comes to bass fishing, I don't think there's anything quite like a topwater bite. Oh, we got it right there. That is a better one. Stay on there, man. Not only is this one of the most explosive ways to catch a bass, but you can also catch numbers and big fish on a topwater. So this video is going to be a complete topwater masterclass. We're gonna start off by talking about when you should be throwing each different style of topwater bait. Then I'm gonna go over kind of the top 5 topwater lures. We're gonna talk about tips and tricks and mistakes when it comes to walking style baits, popper style baits, whopper plopper style baits, frog baits, and buzz baits. And the last thing that I'm gonna do is talk about a few ways that you can keep those topwater fish hooked and put them on the shoreline or in the boat. So let's go ahead and dive into topwater fishing, so stay tuned. It's gonna be a good one. This video is brought to you by my apparel company, Fin Fishing. Right now for the month of October 2024, you can buy a USA made sun shirt and a bass hat for $67. All you have to do is add the sun shirt of your choice to cart, add the hat of your choice to cart, and you will see that automatic discount at checkout. Shopping at Fin Fishing is truly one of the best ways to help support the Bass Fishing HQ channel. I greatly appreciate all of you who have done so. Now, a walking bait or a spook style bait like the one that I'm holding right here is probably one of the most popular topwaters. It's the one that I probably fish the most, and it's most well known for the way that it can just walk the dog back and forth. This topwater to me is what I call my open water topwater. Anytime that I'm fishing open water situations, that is when I pick up this walking bait. And what I mean by open water is just when I'm fishing, you know, off the bank. I'm not casting towards the bank, I'm fishing off the bank. So it might be a large grass flat area, or it might be out in the middle of a pond if you're fishing a pond. Or maybe I am fishing this bait across a big point, or maybe even some offshore brush piles that I'm trying to draw fish out of. Anytime I'm fishing in open water situations, that is when I pick up this bait. I typically want pretty clear water when I'm fishing a walking bait. You can fish it in off color and muddy water, and typically when I do that, I am throwing it closer to the bank, but I pick this bait up more times than not when I'm fishing those open water, clear water situations. Now, something I think a lot of guys get wrong about a spook style bait is thinking that bass are only gonna bite it in low light conditions. And there are times of the year where they only will bite it in low light conditions, but a lot of times, even in the heat of the summer, I will throw this bait in the middle of the day and be able to catch a lot of fish on it. So don't think that this is just a low light condition bait, or topwaters in general or low light conditions bait. You can catch them when the sun comes up. Now, the popper style bait is again one of my favorites, and I'm probably going to say that all of these are my favorite, and it's just because I love topwater fishing so much. But you know, something that's really nice about these popper style baits is you can work them really slow, and you can also work them really fast, and you can catch bass both ways. Now, typically, when I fish a popper, I am actually fishing it not in open water. I am actually fishing it against the bank. Maybe I am target casting around docks or around stumps, or maybe around little grass patches that I can visibly see. Anytime I want that bait to kind of hang out in an area for a long time, that is when I'm going to pick up a popper. Although I primarily target fish with these baits, I will throw them in the same areas that I throw that spook style bait. Now, I typically start with a spook, but if the bass are actually missing a spook, if you have a lot of fish come up there and hit that bait and miss it, that a lot of times is when I'm going to pick up a popper and fish it in those exact same areas. Because this bait is a little bit smaller, and when you pause it, it actually sits tail down like this in the water, you will get a lot of those fish that are missing the spook on a popper. Now, the other time that I will fish this over a spook is if I'm fishing around bass that are eating really small bait fish. You see this a lot in late summer, early fall. A lot of the young of the year bait fish like bluegill and shad are all over the place. That is a time when I'm gonna pick up this popper over any other topwater bait. Now let's talk about ploppers. You know, when this bait came out, there was no bad place to fish this thing. You could fish it anywhere and you would catch a ton of bass, and you would catch a lot of big bass. And the big reason is that a plopper has a very distinctive plopping sound, a very distinctive plopping noise, and the bass had never heard anything like that. And they absolutely tore that bait up for a long time. You could go to pretty much any lake, river, reservoir, it didn't matter, and you would catch fish on a plopper. But now a lot of people have caught on to fishing a plopper, and it has just become kind of another topwater bait that I use in certain situations. Now for me, I consider the plopper to be kind of a bank oriented bait. I like to fish it, you know, when I'm fishing long sections of bank that I don't know where the bass are. Maybe this is a really long rocky section of bank where the bass could be kind of anywhere. You know, a plopper, you can cover a ton of water with that bait, and you can kind of figure out the small sections where those bass are. And if there happens to be a laydown somewhere along that rock stretch or a patch of grass or whatever it may be, you can just continue to throw that plopper right beside it. Now, although you used to be able to catch bass on the plopper pretty much anywhere, now I really like to have a little bit of wind kind of blowing into that area. If there's a little bit of chop on the surface of the water, that seems to be when the plopper really excels, because it's a very noisy bait. It can draw those fish in when you have those windier conditions. Now let's talk about the buzzbait. And the buzzbait to me has a couple of really specific situations that it excels in. And the first one is gonna be warm, off color to muddy water. If you're gonna catch bass in muddy water on a topwater, this is the bait that you're going to catch them on. Something else that a buzzbait really excels around is wood cover, because you can bring this thing right over wood cover, wood pilings, laydowns, standing timber, and it's not going to get hung up, where some of these other baits with treble hooks will get hung up. So if you're fishing around muddy or off-color water that is warm, where you have a lot of wood, that is where I like a buzzbait. Now, in those situations, it does seem like you want lower light conditions, whether that is fishing it early in the morning, late at night, or even shade pockets or a cloudy day. That is when I love to fish a buzzbait. Now, the other situation where a buzzbait will outperform the rest of these baits is in cold water. I have caught bass on buzzbaits. I've said it a million times on this channel, but I've caught fish on buzzbaits in 47-degree water temperatures. And if you're fishing between 47 and 55 degrees, a lot of guys are not thinking about picking up a topwater, and a buzzbait will catch some of the biggest bass in that water temperature. It's unbelievable. You won't get a ton of bites, but the ones that you get will be gargantuan. So do not sleep on a buzzbait in cold water. Now, the next topwater is a prop bait. You know, this is gonna be a bait like a devil's horse. You know, these became extremely popular in lakes down in Florida, but people use them all across the country. Now, a prop bait to me is a spawning lure. If the bass are spawning or the bluegill are spawning, this is the bait that you want to pick up. There's just something about the noise that this bait makes and how you can pause it and it just sits still that absolutely drives a bass crazy when it is on a bed. And also when you're fishing around bluegill beds, this is my first bait that I'm going to pick up a lot. It really mimics a bluegill well, and you can kind of fish it on the outsides of a bluegill bed and catch a lot of bass. So anytime you're fishing around the bluegill spawn or bass spawn, pick up that prop bait. The next topwater is wake baits, and wake baits to me, out of all these baits, are the one that I have probably the least experience with. This is something that I really want to start dialing in over the next year or two, because I know that there are situations where a bass will eat a wake bait when they will not hit anything else. My first experience with a wake bait was actually when I was like 15 or 16 years old, and me and my best friend were fishing a pond. And this particular pond, if you would catch like 2 fish in 2 or 3 hours, that was a pretty good day. Like, it wasn't really easy to catch fish in this pond. But I remember this one 4th of July evening, we were actually getting ready to go to a cookout, and my buddy picked up a jointed wake bait and he was fishing it in this pond, and in 25 minutes he caught 9 bass on this. And I can remember it to this day because we were blown away by this. We had thrown poppers and Cincos of all things and just weren't catching a lot of fish. And he picked up this jointed wake bait and absolutely mauled the bass on it. Now, the big thing that I found with the wake bait is that you want calm water. In really, really calm water, it seems like this wake bait just has a tremendous drawing power, where those fish will come from 15 or 20 feet away to eat that bait. Now, typically, again, with this bait, I want clear water. A lot of top waters, I like clear water, but definitely with a wake bait. Now, the next bait is a toad style bait. And when I talk about fishing a toad, I'm talking about fishing just the toad. I'm not talking about threading this onto a buzz bait and fishing it that way. I'm talking about fishing just the toad. Now, there are some obvious situations that a toad excels. I mean, if you're fishing around shallow vegetation, lily pads, reeds, grass, I mean, this thing will come through anything and it can trigger some really big bites. But another situation that I really like this bait, where a lot of guys don't pick it up, is actually in really late summer. If you're fishing in late summer, those bass have just seen so many different baits. They've seen every single topwater bait that you own, and throwing a frog in some of those same situations, this is just a very subtle lure, especially the Zoom horny toad. You know, when it comes across the water, it doesn't have a tremendous commotion. It's just very subtle. And sometimes in late summer, when those bass have been beat up, this bait will really excel. You can fish it around shallow water vegetation, but you can also fish it around shallow rock cover and shallow wood cover. So in that late summer, you know, September, this is a bait that I throw a lot in that month. Now, the last topwater I'm going to talk about is a frog, and I am sure that I missed some other topwater baits that I'm just not thinking about. But to me, the frog obviously is going to excel when you're fishing it around matted vegetation or slop. This is probably the #1 reason that we all pick up a frog, whether that's slop in a pond or on a big lake. You know, you can fish this bait over that mat, and those fish are going to come through that mat to get this bait. Now, the other situation that I like a frog in is when I just need to skip a bait, whether I'm skipping it underneath of a dock or maybe under overhanging trees and I'm fishing those small shade pockets. That is where a frog excels. Now, when it comes to a walking style topwater bait, you will hear me refer to this as a spook a lot of times, but just know that I'm talking about any type of walking bait out there. Now, when it comes to spooks, this is probably the topwater that I throw the most. And that's really because of where I live in the country and the fisheries that I fish. I really think that a spook is a great bait when you're fishing kind of open water situations, clear water. I fish it across a lot of larger flats, maybe they're grass flats or maybe even rock flats, but that is a great place to fish this bait. Now, it may not be the topwater that you throw the most, just depending on where you live in the country and the fisheries that you fish. Now, with all that being said, let's talk about 3 big things that you should know about a spook that I think are very important. Probably the most important thing when it comes to fishing the walking style bait, the spook style bait, is I think that sound is the biggest turn on or turn off when it comes to fishing this particular topwater bait. And what I mean by is the actual sound of the baits. A lot of spooks out there on the market have a lot of rattles in them. I mean, they have sometimes a couple of bigger ball bearings in there. Sometimes they have little BBs. They tend to make a lot of noise. Now, the noise can be a great thing. Sometimes you actually want a bait that has a lot of noise because that noise can really help draw fish up from the depth. And we're actually going to talk about that here in just a minute. But sound sometimes can also be a turn off for fish. Sometimes when you're fishing really clear water, like I kind of talked about that I do a lot, or if you're fishing in highly pressured situations, which we continue to see more and more across the country, or when you are fishing in really dead, calm conditions where there's no wind, there's no nothing out there, sometimes too much sound will really deter a fish from hitting that bait. So when it comes to fishing spook style baits, I always make sure that I do have an option that has, you know, those ball bearings, those BBs, and makes a lot of noise. I also want to make sure that I have an option that does not have any sound. This little bait right here, this is an Evergreen JT. It comes in a couple of different sizes, a 95 and 100, and this is one of my favorite baits. If you've been on the Bass Fishing HQ channel or even my other channels before, you know that this is one of my favorite topwaters, and that's because there are no BBs. There is no sound to this bait. If you hear me shake it, nothing. Absolutely nothing at all. And that subtle action can be so key out there on the water. I have seen a number of days where you will pick up loud, obnoxious, noisy topwaters. You will not get bit. You pick this thing up and you will catch fish behind people often. It is just that good of a bait. Now, this is not the only silent topwater out there on the market. There are some other ones. I actually just heard of a different company that's coming out with a new silent topwater, but I truly believe that this is one of the biggest differences when it comes to spook fishing, is making sure that you are selecting the kind of the right lure for that right day. Now, like I talked about, there are definitely situations where they do like noise. Really what I tend to do is kind of start out with my kind of traditional noisier topwater baits. And if the bass are eating it, if I feel like I'm catching them pretty good, then I will just stick with that bait. But if I see a lot of fish missing the bait, or maybe they're boiling on the bait, they're not committing to the bait, or maybe they're not hooked really good, the first thing that I'm gonna do is I'm gonna reach for one of those topwater walking baits that does not have rattles on it. It truly makes a humongous difference. Now, the second thing when it comes to fishing a spook or a walking style topwater bait is really the cadence at which you fish this bait. And there's a few different things within the cadence that I want to talk about. Now, the first thing is that I think a lot of anglers, when they get out there and they're fishing this bait on the water, they all kind of do the exact same thing. They're going to cast this bait out, they're going to walk the dog with it, and they all tend to walk the dog at the same pace. You know, maybe that's a choo, 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 choo. And they do that all the way back to the boat. Now, don't get me wrong, there are days out there on the water where it does not matter the cadence that you do with a walking style topwater bait, the bass are going to hit it. And there are a lot of days that are like that. But we want to be a little bit better. We don't always want to do what everyone else does. So something that I found to be really, really important with a walking style topwater is really the speed at which you fish these baits. Because like I said, everyone kind of fishes them in a similar speed. But what I found is that there are days where actually working this either a lot faster or a lot slower can really help you to get more bites. And so some days I'll cast this bait out there and I'll actually walk this thing very fast. I mean, as fast as I can twitch my rod, and it's going do, 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 back and forth. Now, if you live in areas of the country, for example, down in South Carolina, Georgia, you know, there's a lot of blueback herring in those areas. And that is a very fast bait fish, you know, that spends a lot of time in open water. And so if you live in those areas, you almost do this all the time. Work this bait extremely fast, because I have seen down in those places that you can work a bait too slow and the bass just get too good of a look at it. So sometimes you're just casting this out and literally reeling it as fast as you can. But even in other parts of the country, working a topwater spook really, really fast can trigger bass that may not kind of eat that same bait when you're working it at kind of your normal pace, you know, back and forth. Now, on the complete opposite side of the spectrum, you also have days out there where you need to slow this bait down, where really walking it at a slow pace can mean a big difference in the number of bites that you get. And let me tell you guys that there's definitely some situations, you know, when I have really calm days out there on the water, that's a time where I like to work the bait really slow. But what I have seen is that this all comes down to experimenting. And you can do this within the same day. You can go out there, you can fish, you know, make a cast, work that bait really fast all the way back to the boat. Make a cast, work it kind of at your normal pace. Make a cast, work it slower. Continue to do that until you start catching fish, and you will start to see patterns. You will see days where they're hitting it on the slow. You will see days where they're hitting it no matter what you do. That's what you see a lot. You will see it when they're hitting it fast, they're hitting it slow, they're hitting it at the normal pace, and that's when you can just kind of go out there and fish it however you want, and you're gonna catch fish. But it's always good to experiment. Now, one other thing that when it comes to cadence that I think is extremely important with a spook, and this is something that you don't always hear guys talk about, is I like to have some pattern interruptions with my bait, some cadence interruptions with the bait. So not only am I gonna work it really fast or work it really slow or kind of my normal pace, But I also like to say, for example, if I'm working that bait kind of a normal pace, chew, 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 I will have some pattern interruptions, like I just said, some cadence interruptions, where I will speed that bait up 3, 4, 5, 6 times, just hit it real hard, do, 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 and then I will let that bait pause for a minute, and then I will continue my the way that I work it. So that, I'm telling you, is a triggering mechanism for bass. This is what I do with a lot of topwater baits, not just a spook style bait. With a lot of topwater baits, I like to have some cadence interruptions where I pop the bait, where I slow that bait down, where I completely kill that bait, because what a lot of anglers don't know is that a lot of our cast, there will be bass that are following this bait. They're just under the water, and you can see this a lot more now with your live scopes and your forward-facing sonars, but you will see those bass right below the surface. And even if you don't have those electronics to be able to see the fish, I just do this by nature on every single cast. I'm gonna speed that bait up real quick and pause it, or I'm just gonna all of a sudden kill the bait and let it sit. Those things can cause those bass that are following the bait to actually commit to it, where they actually come up there and get it. This just happened to me over the summer. I was fishing a lake for smallmouth bass, and every time I would be working that bait in my normal pace, I would speed it up. I'd go 4, 5, 6 times really fast. As soon as I did that, bam, it would trigger those smallmouth. I got every single bite in one day of fishing because I would speed that bait up. So always add some cadence, like interruptions to your bait. I'm telling you, that can make a really big difference. Now, the last thing, the third thing that I want to talk about when it comes to fishing a spook is do not be afraid to fish this in deeper water. I think for a lot of anglers, when we think about fishing topwater baits, we're thinking about fishing them in pretty shallow water. I would say less than 6, 7, 8 foot of water most of the time. But I'm telling you what, a bass will come a long distance to get a spook. Now, I'm not saying that they'll do this every single day, and I'm not saying that they do this in every single body of water, but when you are fishing really clear bodies of water especially, you would be surprised at how far a distance bass will come to get a spook. I remember actually a co-angler a number of years ago. I was fishing a Bassmaster Open up on Lake Champlain. There's a lot of smallmouth in that lake, and I was fishing in 20 to 25 foot of water using a drop shot. And I had a co-angler that was in the back of my boat, and he was fan casting all over the place with a topwater walking bait, spook style bait. And I'm gonna be 100% honest with you, I thought the dude was crazy. I'm like, what is this guy doing? We are in 20 plus foot of water. There is no way a bass is going to come up to get that bait. And guess what? He caught several that day, and he caught some big ones on it. And I will never forget that day, because it's, you know, it's not one of the only days a co-angler showed me something, but it was one of those things that I always held on to. And so when I go fishing, I do not just throw this in shallow water. I have no problem throwing this over a brush pile that's sitting in 15 foot of water and actually getting those fish to come out to hit that bait. I have no problem throwing this over a grass flat, maybe in 10 to 12 foot of water, or 13 or 15 foot of water, and getting those fish to come out and get that bait. So do not be afraid to throw a topwater like a spook in deeper water. You would be surprised at how far the bass come for it. One of my favorite baits of all time is the Plopper, this little guy right here. It's one of the first topwaters I ever caught a lot of bass on, and today is all about the Plopper. We got fish busting over here. Oh shoot, literally, fish busting. Well, Sorry to start off the show like this. The bass was literally just busting right there while I was trying to do an intro. Stay tuned. It's gonna be a good one. I really think that over the last several years that people have actually kind of stopped using baits like a popper as much as they used to. With the invention of so many other topwater baits. I mean, you have spooks, you have whopper ploppers, you have all the frogs that you can have. I really think that people have actually kind of gotten away from using some sort of popper. A popper is still just as effective as it's always been. When it comes to fishing a popper, I think there are two things that are vitally important, and understanding these couple of key concepts will help you to get a lot more bites on this bait. Now, the first one is actually going to be how you work the bait itself. There are really three different ways that you can work a popper. The first way, and one of the most popular ways, is by blooping it, okay? What I mean by blooping it is when you cast that bait out and you go to actually pop your rod, if you pop that rod on slack line, so if there's a little bit of slack and you pop it, you'll make a bloop noise with your popper. It'll actually like create almost like a bubble in the front of your popper, and it literally makes a bloop noise. Like you'll hear it bloop, bloop. What I have found is that anytime I am fishing around bass that seem to be eating bluegill, it seems like that is the noise that they like. That is the way they like it. I don't know why. I don't know if it somehow reminds them of a bluegill. I don't really know, but it seems like anytime that I'm fishing around bluegill eating bass, if I make that bloop noise, I tend to catch more bass. Oh, I love it so much. Now, the next way of actually working this bait is what I call spitting the bait. And this is actually when you're gonna pop the rod, but you're gonna pop the rod on tight line. So you're actually gonna make sure that your line is taut. And when you pop it with that taut line, it actually spits out in front. It's not gonna create a bubble where it bloops. You'll actually see it spit water, sometimes a foot, 2 foot, 3 foot in front. Now, I probably fish it that way most of the time. I fish for bass that eat a lot of minnows and shad. And for whatever reason, if you're fishing around fish that eat minnows and shad, that spitting sound, it just happens to look more like one of those minnows or sound like one of those minnows, and it really seems like the bass hone in to that spitting sound. So the third way that you can work a popper is actually walking the dog, where you actually make this bait go back and forth. Now, not all poppers, especially smaller poppers, are gonna work well for this. It can be very difficult to walk them. This particular popper that I'm holding here, the one that I was fishing earlier, is a TP70, and it actually has a really great walking motion. If you kind of work it like you would walking a frog, where you kind of just small twitches, it will actually go back and forth in the water. That tends to be one of the ways that I like to work this bait during the summertime. If I'm kind of casting under overhanging trees that have little shade pockets, I'm actually gonna work it back and forth like that out of that shade pocket and then make my next cast. Now, the truth is that although you can walk the dog, you can spit it, you can bloop it, sometimes it doesn't matter, right? Sometimes you're gonna get to the water and the fish are just active and they're gonna hit this no matter how you work the thing. It literally doesn't matter. But there are times that it makes a huge difference. So really, whenever you go out there fishing, just mess around with how you're working the bait to see which ones the bass like more. Now, with that being said, what I think is probably the most important part of a popper is the speed at which you work it. So you have the different ways that we just talked about that you can work it, but you also have the speed at which you do it. A general rule of thumb, a lot of times when I'm fishing this bait in the springtime, kind of around the spawn of the year, I tend to fish it a little bit slower in general. Those fish tend to be shallow, they tend to be very target oriented. So I like to kind of fish it shallow, keep it by those targets as long as I can. And even if the bass are actually on beds and spawning, you can get them to come up and hit a popper. Now, as the water temperature warms in the spring, I tend to start working this bait a lot faster, and sometimes working it extremely fast. Anytime you are fishing around bass that are eating bait fish and they're schooling from time to time, you almost can't work this bait fast enough. And yeah, you could use other baits like a Zara spook in this case, but I have seen it at times, especially when the bass are eating really small bait fish. If they're chasing these little minnows like this big or really small shad, a popper is going to get more bites than one of those bigger spook baits. Now, another thing that's important to know about a popper and actually topwaters in general is it's kind of a misconception that you need overcast days to catch bass on topwater baits. Especially if you're fishing clear water lakes during the middle of summer, it seems like bass will hit a popper no matter what time of the day that it is, even if the sun is directly overhead. Now, adding in a little bit of wind is going to help that a lot. If you have a little bit of wind, even if the sun is bright and sunny, fish will hit topwaters. Now, there are times that having low light is what you want. For instance, this morning I was fishing a pretty shallow clear water area. It was really kind of a unique area because it was a small pocket that had an island in the middle of it. So because I was fishing shallow water and very clear water, I knew that it would probably be a low light condition bite. So when I got into this little area, I actually got a bite kind of on the right-hand side. The right-hand side looked better to me, but I knew that that right-hand side, because of the way that the sun was coming up, would have shade longer than some of the other parts of this little area. So I actually went and I hit the banks that I knew that sun was going to hit first. Those were the banks that I hit first because the sun was still starting to come up. I wanted to take advantage of those areas before the sun got really high, and it allowed me to really maximize my bites on this topwater. That way I was targeting the shade lines later after the sun had already risen. Now, what I have seen from a lot of guys when they talk about fishing a popper is that there's a lot of different guys who have different rod, reel, line combinations for everything. As you can see here, this is actually some monofilament line, but I actually just have a very small leader that's attached to braided line. I tend to fish 30-pound braid for almost all of my topwaters, and I will always attach a very small monofilament leader. As you can see here, I got about a foot and a half leader length. Even if I only have about 6 inches or 7 inches of that leader, that's fine with me. Now, the reason that I use a leader on my baits is actually for 2 reasons. One, that monofilament does stretch. So having a little extra stretch when you're using a treble hooked bait like this, I think is a good thing to allow you to actually catch more bass that bite it. Sometimes bass are gonna dig right at the end of the boat, and although your rod is doing most of the action, having a little bit of give in your line will just really help keep that fish pinned. Now, the other reason that I use a leader is because if you fish it straight braid, what you're gonna see happen from time to time is you're gonna make a long bomb cast out there, and that braid is gonna get hung around this front hook, and it fouls up that entire cast because the braid is a lot more limber, where this monofilament is a little bit thicker, a little bit tauter, and it keeps that line away from the hooks. Now, the big thing with the leader is you don't want to go too long. If you have a 3-foot leader, that's too long because when you go to make a cast, that knot is actually going to be inside your guides. And because I'm using pretty heavy pound test, this is actually 20-pound test that I'm using as leader, it's a really big knot and I don't want it inside my guide. Now, there are guys that like to fish this bait on straight monofilament. Now, here's the big key. If you're fishing it on straight monofilament, you don't want to use 20-pound tests like I'm using for a leader. You want to go a lot lighter than that. Something in the 12-pound to 15-pound range is really going to be what you want if you're using a bait caster. If you're using a spinning rod to fish a popper, you could go down to 10-pound or 8-pound monofilament, and that's going to do just fine. But for me, I really like braided line to monofilament leader. It's the way that I've always done it. Now, your rod is one of the most critical parts of this entire system. You really kind of want that medium power rod in a moderate action. When the whopper plopper first came out, it was absolutely incredible. You could throw it just about anywhere and catch a ton of big bass. There was a lot of major tournaments that were being won with the whopper plopper. And since then, the whopper plopper has kind of died a little bit. It's not as easy to go out there and catch fish, but the whopper plopper is still a very effective tool at catching bass. Now, when I say whopper plopper or plopper today, what I'm really referring to is these plopping style baits. You know, the original was the river to sea whopper plopper. You know, today I've been fishing the Berkeley Chopo a lot, but after fishing this bait a lot and also fishing with other guys, you know, co-anglers or friends that have fished this bait, there are a few big mistakes that I see a lot of anglers make that really affect them landing fish or getting bit with the plopper. Now, mistake number one when it comes to fishing a whopper plopper is not setting your plopper up for success. If you just take a plopper out of the package and start throwing it, there are times where you're going to miss fish that hit that bait and you're going to lose fish that you hook up with that bait. And there are a few things that I do to the bait that I think make a huge difference on hooking up and landing those fish. Now, I don't believe that you have to do a ton of crazy modifications to the whopper plopper, but a few things that I do like to do is one, simply change out the hooks on a bait, and especially if you're fishing the river to sea whopper plopper. The hooks that come on a river to sea whopper plopper are very thick. It's a very heavy gauge wire hook, and yes, if you can get that hook to penetrate, it will probably hold very well, but I've seen a lot of times that people simply do not get that hook to penetrate past the barb, and they will lose a lot of fish with that hook that comes on a whopper plopper. So I highly suggest putting on a higher quality hook. There are a lot of good hooks on the market. I know guys that love Gamakatsu round bends. I know guys that love the Owner round bends. I personally like the Berkeley Fusion 19 hook. That hook is extremely sharp and it does not bend out. And I think that those are two really key factors into landing a lot more fish. Now, if you're fishing like the 110 or 130 size, typically that takes a number 2 hook. Anything below that, I typically put a number 4 sized hook on. Now, the other part of setting your bait up for success actually comes down to fishing the right sized whopper plopper. And this is another thing that is so important. I typically like to fish the 110 size plopper. That's kind of the medium size plopper. Now, if I have fish start missing that bait, if they come up there and they just hit it, they knock it, you don't hook up with fish, a lot of times I will downsize that bait and I will actually go to like the 75 series. But I don't always downsize. Sometimes I've actually found that you will hook up with more fish by upsizing the plopper. And this really just comes down to experimentation. If you have fish missing that plopper, try downsizing, try upsizing the bait. That is probably the most critical thing to getting more fish to commit to that bait. Mistake number 2 that I see a lot of guys make with a plopping style bait actually comes down to the rod that they use with the bait. I feel like it's just kind of known that you throw a whopper plopper with a flipping rod, a big 7-foot, 6-inch heavy inch rod. I feel like that is just kind of what you hear a lot when you read different articles or listen to guys talk about the whopper plopper. Now, the thing is, the plopping style bait is basically like a big crankbait. It's got treble hooks on it. And any time that I'm using a treble hooked lure bait, I really like to have a parabolic bending rod, a rod that basically bends all the way through. It will bend here at the butt as well as the tip. Having that rod that is more of a parabolic bend, it simply helps you to keep fish on that you hook. And I cannot tell you how important that is, especially when you're throwing the plopping style baits. These are typically bigger, heavy baits, and bass can throw them really easily. I mean, if they come out of the surface and they're shaking, this bait is flipping and flopping all over the place. And so having that parabolic bending rod, that more moderate action rod, is so critical into actually landing fish. The rod that I have really come to love when it comes to throwing a whopper plopper is actually a chatterbait style rod. This is a 7-foot, 4-inch medium heavy power moderate action rod. Now, this particular rod is the Arc Tharp series rod. It's the B Hitte rod. This rod was designed for a chatterbait. It has a more parabolic bending action, but it also has backbone to it. And that is, in my opinion, a perfect rod for a whopper plopper style bait. If that fish is barely hooked, actually take a look at this fish right here. This is exactly why you want a more parabolic bending rod. Barely had that bait. That is exactly why you want to use a softer rod, not a flip stick. So as you can see there, that fish was barely hooked. If I had a very stiff rod, more like a flipping stick, there's a good chance that that fish would have just ripped off. When it went to dive at the boat, it may have just completely ripped off and I would have lost that fish. So to me, this is a critical thing you want to do with that plopping style bait, is make sure you have that right rod, something that has more of a moderate action. Now, mistake number 3 that I see a lot of guys make with this plopping style bait is simply just casting that bait out and reeling it straight back in at a steady pace. Now, that will get you bites. You will catch some fish on a plopping style bait by simply just retrieving it at a steady pace. But something that I think is so important is to add a little bit of action every now and then to your bait. And what I mean by that is my typical cast, I'm gonna cast that bait out and I'm gonna start my retrieve, but every now and then I'm literally just going to twitch my reel handle like that, which just makes that bait spit a little bit of water. It makes it kind of just jolt forward. Another thing that I've learned to do is just completely stop that bait. Every now and then I'm reeling it and I will just kill the bait, just completely kill it for just a second or two and then start my retrieve again. And doing those two things, kind of popping that bait or just stopping that bait, I'm telling you, there are days that you are out there where that is the only way that you will catch a fish. A lot of times when we're reeling this bait along, there are fish that are tracking the bait. They are just below the bait, they are tracking the bait. And when you twitch it or you pause it, it just causes a reaction strike. They have to go up there, they have to crush it, and you will catch so many more fish by simply switching up that retrieve and not just steady reeling it all the time. That's a real critical tip, something that can help you to get a lot of extra bites on the plopper. Now, the 4th mistake that I see a ton of guys make is being too noisy with the bait. And what I mean by noisy is a lot of guys, if they see a target that they want to fish, for instance, we got kind of the end of a laydown up here. If that's where you think the bass is, do not have that plopping style bait land where you think that fish is, because the plopper is a bigger bait. When it hits the water, it's gonna create a loud noise. So you do not want your bait to land where you think that fish is. That is really something that is really key with every bait that we fish. So if I think that that fish is sitting right there on the end of that laydown, I'm gonna cast past my target and I'm gonna bring that plopper to the target. That is something that is very simple, but some guys just don't always think about that. Now, sometimes no matter what you do with the plopper, you're going to have fish that come up to that bait and they just miss it. You can upsize, you can downsize, you can change your hooks, you can do everything, and they just miss that bait. This actually brings me to mistake number 5 that I see a lot of anglers make, and that is not having a throwback bait ready to go. And what I mean by a throwback bait is a bait that is ready to go, that when that fish misses it, you can actually pick up your other rod. For me, I throw a wacky rig a lot and toss where that fish just blew up. A lot of times that bass is going to stay in that immediate area. If you have that throwback bait laying off the side of your boat and ready to go, you can get that bait to that fish extremely quick, and a lot of times you will catch that fish with your throwback bait. Now, a wacky rig is one that I use a lot. Another really good one is simply just a weightless fluke. Now, if you are a tournament fisherman, this is definitely something that you need to have ready to go anytime you're fishing a topwater bait. No matter where I go, from New York to Florida, Alabama, I have caught a ton of fish on a frog. And today I'm gonna give you 7 hacks that will actually help your frogs to last longer. It will help with your hookup ratio, and it will simply help you to catch more fish on frogs. So let's dive into those right now. Now, the first hack is all about making your frogs last longer. And if your frogs last longer, they're going to catch more fish on them. So this trick, this hack is pretty much guaranteed to help you to catch more fish on the frog. For years, when I used to fish a frog, I would fish a frog all day, I would cut it off, I'd throw it in my box, and then maybe a week later when I went out fishing again, I'd pull that frog out and I would have Mr. Kinky legs. If you guys have seen this before, you know that this is one of the biggest issues when it comes to fishing a frog, is sometimes you pull them out and the legs are all stuck to each other. They're kind of bent at a weird angle and it pretty much ruins that frog. Now there's a really simple trick that I actually learned from Kyle Welcher's YouTube channel years ago that can help you to keep your frog legs nice. All you have to do for this one is add some baby powder to your frog box. That baby powder kind of helps soak up some of that water, so when you put that frog back in that box, it really helps to keep those legs pristine, just like you took it right out of the package. Now your frog box is gonna look a little funny covered in baby powder, but literally as soon as you start casting that frog out, that baby powder comes off and that frog is fresh and it's ready to go. Now the second hack can really help improve your hookup ratio with a frog. One of my all-time favorite frogs, the one that I probably fish most of the time, is a Spro popping frog. I've caught more fish on this frog than any other frog. I like that it's a little bit more slender. That really helps my hookup ratio in general, but the plastic of this frog is actually a little bit hard when you first take it out of the package. And what I mean by hard is it's a little bit hard to actually collapse this frog to expose the hooks. So sometimes that can actually impact your hookup with fish and it can cause you to lose a few fish. So the best thing that you can do is actually make these frogs a little bit softer. And the best way to do that is simply by boiling your frog. Boiling that frog will actually kind of break down the fibers of that plastic and it will permanently make that frog a little bit softer. So just a little test for you. I have two brand new poppin' frogs. This actually happens to be one of my favorite colors, which if you want to know is called natural red. I'm gonna boil one of these. I'm not gonna boil the other one, so you can kind of see the difference between the two at the end. Don't boil your frogs with the same pot that you use to boil your food. I just don't think that's a good idea. All right, the water is now boiling. I'm gonna throw that guy in there. I'm gonna set my timer for 1 minute. I'm just gonna let him do his thing. Alrighty. Now here are our two frogs. They are now the exact same temperature. I let them sit out. This one right here we didn't boil, and this one we did boil. Now I can just tell you that this one is substantially easier to collapse, but I kind of wanted to show you. So if I take the one that we didn't boil and I take this 2-ounce weight right here and I set it on there, as you can see, it really doesn't collapse hardly at all. I mean, it pretty much is still flat across the top. And 2 ounces isn't a lot of weight, especially for a bass, but I just wanted to show you the difference here. Now, if I take this 2-ounce weight off this one, here's the frog that we boiled. And if I set it on there, you can see right away how it divoted. It actually went down. So it just goes to show you that this does soften up the plastic. It does make it easier to collapse. I know that that seems a little bit extreme, but if you are having problems hooking up with fish or losing fish, this can really help solve that problem. Now, with that being said, I have actually fished on lakes before where I will literally see bass come up and grab the tails of a frog and actually go off with just the tails in its mouth. It's happened to me a lot growing up in Ohio because I fish for a lot of those 1.5 to 2 pound fish. This actually brings me to my third hack when it comes to frog fishing, and that is simply add a frog trailer hook. If you guys haven't heard of this frog trailer hook before, it's actually a really good one. It's made by Lake Fork Tackle. It's called the Frog Tail Hook. It's really simple to use. All you do is take this thing out of the package, you put it on the 2 hooks of your frog, and adding this trailer hook can really help increase those bites, especially if you're running into that problem where those bass are coming up and they're biting the tails of the frog. This is a really simple hack. You don't always need to do it, but there are times where having this trailer hook is going to mean the difference between you catching that fish and getting a lot of cool blow-ups. Now, speaking of hooking up with fish on frogs, the fourth hack is a little bit more of a tip, and that is do not set the hook right away when a fish hits your bait. Probably the biggest mistake that I see a lot of anglers make with a frog is that they automatically set the hook as soon as that fish blows up on that bait. I remember years and years ago, I was fishing on Lake St. Clair for largemouth with frogs, and I was missing a lot of frogs because I was setting the hook too soon. And that lake is really, really clear. And I actually remember seeing a fish come up. He hit the frog and he just grabbed one of the tails like this, and he started swimming down. And as he was swimming down, he engulfed the rest of the frog. And then I set the hook and I caught that fish. But I remember visually seeing that and realizing that I was setting the hook way too soon. And sometimes a bass actually needs to get this bait a little bit better before you can set the hook. So when that fish comes up there and he hits that bait, just count in your head to 2 Mississippi, you know, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, set the hook. I actually did an experiment last year where I wanted to see just how long a fish would hold on to a frog, and I'll show that to you real quick.
0 Mississippi, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, 4 Mississippi. Fish has still got it. 5 Mississippi, 6 Mississippi, 7 Mississippi, 8 Mississippi. I'm just gonna sit on them.
So as you can see, a bass will hold on to a frog just like they will a soft plastic or a jig. So give it a few seconds before you set the hook. Now the 5th hack will actually help you to catch more bass when you're fishing around matted vegetation. Whether this is maybe really thick scum mats on a pond or matted milfoil, no matter what it may be, this will help you to catch more fish around matted vegetation. And that is simply adding weights and beads to your frog. Now I've actually shared this on the channel before, but you can actually place a weight and or a bead inside of your frog. And this will help you when you're fishing around a mat, because adding a little weight to that frog as you are pulling it across the mat, it will actually help to kind of sink that frog a little bit lower, which almost creates a little bit of a V-wake on top of that mat. And this really helps the bass to kind of hone in on the frog. Now, when you are adding weight to a frog, the big thing you want to know is that this frog is going to be probably designated for only matted vegetation. Because if you add an 1/8 ounce or even a 1/4 ounce of weight to a frog and you are fishing it in open water situations, that frog may start sinking on you. So just know that when you add weight to a frog, this frog has now become a matted vegetation only frog. Now, the other thing that you can do is add a bead inside of your frog, and the bead is just going to add a little bit extra sound, again helping that bass to hone in on that frog when it is underneath of a mat. Now, hack number 6 is something that I like to do when I'm fishing a frog kind of in more open water. If I'm fishing it underneath docks, or if I'm fishing it under overhanging trees where a bass can really visually see that frog, this is what I like to do with my frogs, and that is basically add a target to your frog. I like to take a red Sharpie marker and I will literally just add a small dot to the bottom of my frog. Typically, I place this dot kind of on the throat of the frog because I want that bass to kind of see that red target right before it goes up to hit that bait. Now, I know that this may not sound substantial, but this is very similar to adding a red treble hook to your front crankbait. It kind of just gives the bass something to target when they are approaching that frog. And if you know anything about the way that a bass sees, a bass can see red and green the best. Those are the 2 colors that it can see the best. So adding that little red mark to the underside of a frog, I think as a bass is coming up to it and they see that little red dot last second, that is what they aim for and that is what they bite. And I think it really helps you to increase your hookups with the frog because they get that bait just a little bit better. Now, just like any of these hacks, this isn't always necessary to do, but it's something that gives me a little bit more confidence, and I think it helps me to catch a few more bass that may have missed the frog otherwise. Now, the 7th and final hack is probably one of the most important ones, and that is actually knowing when to put the frog down. I have seen days out there on the water that no matter what you do to a frog, you will have fish almost boil underneath the frog, or it just seems like they slap at it with their tail. And during those days, you have to put the frog down. And probably the best bait to pick up instead of a frog is a popper. Now, the great thing about a popper is that you can work it back and forth just like you can a frog. But another thing about a popper is when you sit it in the water, a lot of times the popper sits like this in the water. This bottom treble hook will actually sit down a couple inches below the surface. And that really doesn't seem like a lot, but that makes a huge difference on actually hooking up with fish, is having that bait sit below the water. Those fish will come up, they'll grab that bottom treble, and you got them. Now, the buzzbait has been around for a long time. I mean, a lot of anglers have used this bait at some point in their life, but one of the biggest things that I don't hear a lot of anglers talk about is the speed at which you fish a buzzbait. And this is something that I find to be extremely important. There are days on the water where changing up your speed or finding the certain speed that the bass like will really help you to get a lot more bites on a buzzbait. And I've seen this on kind of both ends of the spectrum. For example, there are times where I like to fish a buzzbait in really cold water temps that are in the 50-degree range. And anytime that I'm fishing this bait in cold water, I really like to slow this bait down. And a lot of times, in order to slow a bait down, I'm gonna use a little bit bigger blade on my buzzbait, and I like to add not only a skirt, but some sort of soft plastic like a buzz toad or horny toad style bait to my buzzbait. That really helps me to be able to slow that buzzbait down and really creep it across the top of the water in cold water. And that helps me to get a lot more bites in cold water. Now, if I am fishing in warm water or fishing it during the summer months, a lot of times I like to rip this bait, really bring it fast across the surface of the water, because what you see a lot in the summer months is bass have been caught. They have seen every lure. So if you can create a reaction strike, if you can really rip that bait across a piece of wood or down a riprap bank, those fish really have to decide right then and there if they're going to bite that bait. And sometimes this is a great way to catch some really big fish in the middle of summer, is just ripping this bait down the bank. Now, this actually brings me to tip number 2, which is very important, and this is something you just don't see a lot of guys do, and that is make sure you pop a buzzbait, okay? Anytime you are fishing it, whether it is in cold water or in warm water, no matter when, every time I make a cast, I'm going to pop this bait probably 2 or 3 times during my cast. And what I mean by popping it is I'm gonna cast this bait out, and I'm not just gonna sit there and reel it at the same pace. Every now and then, I'm just gonna pop my reel handle, or I can pop my rod up like that, and it basically just makes that bait go forward and just kind of spit a little bit. And I have seen so many times that that will be the difference between you catching fish and not, is by popping that bait. I saw this really clearly at Lake Norman several years ago. The only way that a fish would hit a topwater like a buzzbait is if you were reeling that bait and all of a sudden you hit the reel handle, you pop that bait up just a little bit, and that is when the fish would commit to the bait. It was like they were tracking it, they were following it, but as soon as you popped it, they would commit to it. They would come up there and they would snatch it. So just make sure that anytime you are fishing this bait, you pop that rod, pop that bait from time to time. Now, tip number 3 is make sure that you have the right equipment for a buzzbait. A buzzbait is a little bit different when it comes to a topwater bait. A lot of topwater baits that we know about, spooks, poppers, ploppers, these are all baits that have treble hooks on them. And obviously a buzzbait just has a single hook. So you're not going to use your traditional topwater equipment with a buzzbait. And as a matter of fact, you can use straight fluorocarbon line with a buzzbait if you really want to. This is something that I did for a long time. A lot of guys think, hey, I can't use fluorocarbon with topwater baits because it drags that lure down. Well, with a buzzbait, you are constantly reeling this bait. There's no way a fluorocarbon even impacts it. And I did this for a long time. I would use straight fluorocarbon 20-pound test, and I used a 7-foot 2-inch heavy power rod, fast action, and that was a great buzzbait rod. I could place that bait anywhere. I could get fish out of heavy cover. Now, though, I actually use braided line, and I really have enjoyed fishing this bait a lot more with braid. The biggest thing that you want to do if you are fishing braided line, like this is 30-pound braid, is make sure that you have a little bit more limber of a rod. This rod here, this is actually a rod that's made by Arc, and it's made for a buzzbait. It's called the Buzz Burner rod. It's a 7-foot, 1-inch rod. It's a fast action rod, but it's a little bit more of a moderate fast in my opinion. This rod actually bends a little bit further down the blank than most fast action rods, but that is perfect for fishing a buzzbait with braided line. So you can fish a buzzbait on fluoro, you can fish it on braid. Just make sure if you fish it on braid like I do, you have that little bit more of a limber rod. It really helps with your hook sets, with hooking up with fish, with putting them in the boat. I lose very few fish with a buzzbait once I hook up. Now, tip number 4 when it comes to fishing a buzzbait is keep your lure color simple. This is something that I really don't mess with a whole lot. I think sometimes a lot of guys just put too much of an emphasis on the color of their lure. For me, there's 3 main color of plastics that I'm gonna use on my buzzbait. And about 90% of the time these days, I'm using a buzzbait that looks just like this with a horny toad on it just like this. I'm gonna use black, I'm gonna use white, and then I'm gonna use either like a green pumpkin or a watermelon. So anytime I'm fishing in muddy water or in really dark conditions, that is when I use the black. So I use the black actually a lot. Now, anytime I am fishing around bass that I know are eating shad, I'm going to use a white color, right? Because most shad in the water are white. Now, anytime I am fishing around bluegill eating bass, I'm gonna use that either green pumpkin or watermelon color. So I keep colors really simple. Now, when it comes to the color of the blade that you are using, I think that this is something, again, a lot of guys just put too much of an emphasis on. If I'm fishing in muddy or really off-color water, I do not personally think the color of the blade matters at all. I think that the blade simply is the attractant. It is what makes the noise, which the bass then look up and try to find. In muddy water though, they're not really seeing a whole lot. They're not even going to really see a lot of flash from that blade at all. Now, if I am fishing really clear water, that is when I will mess around a little bit with the blade color. I still don't always think that it matters that much, if I'm being 100% honest with you. But if I'm fishing a white horny toad in clear water, that's usually when I go with kind of the silver blade like the one that I have here. If I am fishing around bluegill eaters and I'm using that green pumpkin, that's when I actually like that little bit of gold on it, because bluegill have a little bit of gold and oranges on their throat. That's really the only reason, but honestly, I do not think it matters most of the time. Now, the 5th tip when it comes to buzzbait fishing actually has nothing to do at all with a buzzbait. When you fish a buzzbait, no matter what you do at times, you could have the right color, you could use a trailer hook, you could use a toad. You're gonna have days on the water where you have certain fish that just miss that buzzbait. They may hit this bait with a closed mouth, and if they're doing that, you're not gonna hook up with them. But what you can do is have some sort of follow-up bait. This is extremely important. It's something you've probably heard before, but even though you've heard it, I feel like a lot of guys still don't carry it and still don't have this bait ready to go. Now, when it comes to a follow-up bait, a wacky rig is probably number 1 to me. I'm going to match the color of my wacky rig to the color of the buzzbait that I'm using. So if I'm using a black toad on a buzzbait, I'm going to use a black wacky worm. If I'm using a green pumpkin toad, green pumpkin. If I'm using a white, a white. And what I want the bass to think is that they killed whatever they hit. So if you have a bass come up there and they hit a buzzbait really hard, but they miss it, what I do is I get that bait in as quick as I can, pick up my wacky rig and fire it exactly where they hit that bait, and I just let that bait fall. I want the bass to think that whatever they heard, they killed it, and now they can go over there and eat it. And you would be surprised. You're not gonna get every single fish, but you would be surprised at how many fish that you get on that follow-up bait. And sometimes, you know, for me, if you fish a lot of tournaments like me, it can mean a really big difference in your day. If you listen to a ton of guys and how they got hooked on bass fishing, a lot of them are going to talk about fishing a topwater for the first time and seeing a bass come up there and just nail that bait. And it's something that it's truly exciting and it's a little bit addicting. For me as a tournament fisherman, I have always loved to fish a topwater because they tend to get a bigger than average bite, which is what I want to do when I'm fishing a tournament. I want to catch a bigger than average fish. But if you do not have the right system from your hooks to your topwater to your line to your rod and everything, you're going to lose a lot of fish on a topwater. So today I want to give you 5 different tricks that will really help you to start landing more fish on top. Now the first trick is actually a little bit more of a tip, and this is keep your colors simple. I think so many anglers spend way too much time in the bottom of their boat, or if you are a bank angler, you spend it digging through your backpack and your boxes to try to find that perfect color lure that you think is going to help you catch a lot more fish. Now, with a topwater bait, one thing you have to realize is that the bass are only going to be seeing the bottom of that bait, first of all. And second of all, there's really only 4 main shades that I'm going to use pretty much any time that I throw a topwater. The first shade is what I would call a shad shade, and this is any shad colored bait. For instance, this is a little bit more white in color. This is a little bit more bone in color. Now, I'm gonna lump these into the same category because if you know anything about the way a bass can actually see, they've done studies on this, it's hard for them to decipher sometimes between the color chartreuse and white. Okay, so something that is bone colored versus something that is white like this on the belly, those bass are not gonna notice the difference. So I lump bone colors and anything shad colored into this same category. And I'm gonna throw these anytime the bass are feeding heavily on threadfin shad or gizzard shad. The next shade are translucent colored topwater baits. And when I say translucent, I mean that you can see through the bait. Now, I fish these translucent colors a ton because I fish in a lot of clear water situations, and that is what I like these baits for. In clear water, you don't always want the bass to get a good look at that bait. If they get too good of a look at it, they're gonna know that that thing is not real. So a translucent color that they can't see as well, they more or less just see the commotion on top, they're gonna hit that a lot better in that clear water. Now the next shade is a dark shade. For instance, this is a black topwater, and I primarily use a dark shade like this when I'm fishing in overcast conditions. If it is really dark out or even early in the morning, that is when I like to fish a dark colored bait like this. Now, there is one other situation I like, and that is for smallmouth. For some reason, smallmouth love black. No matter if it's sunny, if it's cloudy, they just like that black in color. And so that's another time that I will pick up a black or a dark colored bait. Now, the last shade that I will throw is some sort of chrome colored or something that is extremely flashy. And a lot of times I'm gonna throw this when I'm trying to draw the fish up from a little bit deeper water. If I know that those fish are sitting, 10 foot or more from the surface, that is when I'm gonna use kind of a chrome or shiny colored bait, because that sun will actually hit off that chrome and it will send a little bit of a light flash in the water, which helps those bass to kind of hone in on that bait from deeper water. So when I'm fishing, especially in the Carolinas where those fish feed on blueback herring, that is what I'm gonna fish, a chrome color bait. Now, the only other color that is a little bit different that I will throw from time to time is something that I would consider to be bluegill colored. And all I'm really looking for is something that has a little bit of orange on the belly like this one here. Now, the second trick that will help you catch more fish on topwaters is knowing when to use a feathered treble hook. There was a point for me where no matter what, I would always throw a feathered treble hook on my topwater baits. And for the most part, I still do. I always start with a feathered treble hook, but I have found that there are times where you do not want to throw a feather on the back of your topwater. Now, before I started throwing feathered treble hooks, there were certain days that I would go out fishing a topwater that those fish would come up and hit that bait, and I would miss a lot of those fish. And I found that simply adding a feather would greatly help increase my hookup ratio. For whatever reason, those fish either use it as a target or it just enticed those fish enough that they would commit better to that bait. But One thing that I have found over just fishing a topwater a lot over the years is that sometimes the bass will use this too much of a target. And what I mean by is if you're fishing a topwater and you're catching a lot of fish, but they're all hooked on that back hook, like you hook into that bass and it only has the back hook. The problem with that is that when a bass comes up and jumps, if it only has the back hook, it can swing that topwater bait a lot. And that topwater bait going side to side can actually make you lose a lot of fish. So if you happen to notice that you're catching a lot of fish on that back feathered treble, try actually taking that feather off of there and just putting a standard hook on the back and just see how the bass start hitting that bait. I have seen several times where the bass go from actually hitting that feather to actually committing to more of the front of the bait. And typically when they get the front hooks, they will actually get a couple of other treble hooks, and those fish you don't tend to lose as much as the ones that have that back treble hook. Now, the third trick to catching more fish on a topwater, in my opinion, this is actually what I would define as a game changer, something that can really help you to catch a lot more of those fish that bite, and that is adding a double split ring to your topwater baits. Now, this is a trick that I actually learned from Frank Scalish on Bass Talk Live, so I want to make sure that I give them credit for this. But me and my buddy, we were both listening to this podcast. We heard about this double split ring, and to be honest, when I first heard it, I thought, man, I don't know that that's going to make that much of a difference. Well, me and my buddy, we went out fishing in a certain tournament. We were both throwing the exact same topwater bait. He was throwing the double split rings and I wasn't. And needless to say, the first two fish that blew up on his bait that day, he caught both of them and they were really good fish. The first two fish that hit my bait that day, I missed both of them, okay? And so I immediately switched over to the double split ring rig. I landed every single fish that bit the rest of the day. Now, what that double split ring does is it makes that hook actually hang down a little bit further, and it also allows that hook to have a lot more movement, which helps you to land more fish and helps them to not throw it as easily. So I know it may seem a little bit goofy, but learn from my mistakes and throw that double split ring, especially if you have fish missing the bait. Now, the fourth topwater trick is really knowing when to use a loud bait and when to use a silent bait. And this is something that I find to be extremely important when topwater fishing. If I'm out there fishing a topwater and I have fish missing the bait for whatever reason, a lot of times I'm going to change the sound of a bait before I actually change the color of the bait. A lot of times I feel like I know what color the bass are gonna hit, and sometimes there are days where having a really loud bait is just too much for the fish. This happens a lot when I'm fishing on really calm days, but bass will still come up there and hit topwaters on a calm day. So switching over to a bait that is silent, this is an Evergreen JT 115. It is my favorite silent bait. It literally has no rattles at all in it. But switching over to a bait like this on those calm days, I'm telling you, it can be the difference between catching and hooking fish and not. The fifth topwater tip comes down to the setup in which you throw a topwater with. And this is extremely important to get right because this is going to be the biggest difference between you losing fish and you landing fish. And specifically, I want to talk about your line and rod setup because there are two main lines that you can throw topwaters with. You can throw them with monofilament and you can throw them with braided line. You don't want to use fluorocarbon line because fluorocarbon sinks and it will affect the action of your bait. When it comes down to mono and braid, they are two very different types of line. Mono has a lot of stretch, braid has zero stretch. You want to match the rod that you're using with the line that you're using. If I'm using monofilament that has a ton of stretch and I make a 30 or 40 yard cast, a 100-foot cast, and a bass hits that bait, when I go to set the hook, that line is going to stretch a lot. So I tend to want a longer rod, something that is over 7 foot, 3 inches in length. And I also want something that is more of a medium heavy power. If you're using too short or too limber of a rod with that mono, on that long hook set, you might not even get a hook in that fish, and that's gonna cause you to lose a lot of fish. Now, on the flip side, if you are using braided line, you don't wanna use too heavy of a rod because you will actually rip those hooks out of that fish. I like to use braided line, and I use a 7-foot 2-inch rod that is a medium power rod. That braid has 0 stretch, so when that fish hits way out there, it's almost like he is really close to the boat because that line has 0 stretch. So you can use a softer rod because you're using that braid that has 0 stretch. Now, in both situations, no matter what, I still want to use a parabolic bending rod, a more moderate action when it comes to that rod, because that's also going to help me to keep those fish pegged. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this kind of topwater masterclass. You definitely see some patterns within some of the topwater fishing that I do, whether that's always having some pattern interruptions, maybe that's always having a follow-up bait. There are things that I do every time that I go out there topwater fishing that I really think can help you to catch more on top. So guys, if you enjoyed this video, then you might actually enjoy this video that I did right here talking about fishing a Texas rig. I go through Texas rig. It's kind of a masterclass style as well, and I'm gonna leave that linked right up here. Guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. I will see you in the next one.